Another striking feature of these figures is the solitude. I mean, it's interesting because they're here in the installation. There are three of them, so you'd think that they would be in each other's company. And then also two of the figures, this one and the one over there, have two heads, two faces. And one would think that that would give a sense of company, but actually they can't see each other. That's the tragedy of Janus. He's got two faces, but one looks backward in time, one looks forward, and they can never look at each other. And I'm curious about the relationship of the three pieces to each other, because there's also the sense of solitude, I think, when I think of the myths. Again, to fall back on the myths of the three, Orpheus is bereft of his beloved. That's his tragedy.
Yes.
He never gets her back. Oedipus ends up alone in his blindness, and of course he loses both his wife and his mother in an instant, a single instant, and he's left alone in his blindness. And the Buddha, in order to gain enlightenment, in order to become the Buddha, had to leave his family, had to leave the palace in which he was raised, had to leave his wife, he had to leave the harem, he had to go off alone. And then he's alone in his Buddhahood.
Yeah.
So my question has to do with the solitude of these figures, but at the same time they're in each other's company, but they're
Right.
profoundly solitary.
Yes. Yes. That is life. I mean, these are art objects, and I mean, if you think in myth, which I'm really interested in, because that is the greatest way to traditionally bring in a sense of wisdom and a sense of overseeing the capacities of life that come in these different distorted ways, often. Tarkovsky, Andrei Tarkovsky, do you know him, the director? He made a statement that, well, first of all, as you know, he was called the poet of cinema. And he made a wonderful statement that young people, and this is during the 80s, he was saying this, he said young people need to spend time with themselves. And at that time, he was seeing a lot of young people that never had any time to themselves, you know. And I remember Lindsay, we were talking, Lindsay Jones, and he was asking his students if they had spent time with themselves. And they said, well, you know, my parents went away and the weekend I had some time. Were you watching TV? Oh yeah, of course. You know. We live in a society that solitude is fearful like death is fearful. We don't prepare ourselves and we don't face it. We don't indwell enough, you know, in the sense of reflection and introspection, contemplation. So I think when we see a Buddha figure, when we see something still that gives the capacity of that, it often stills us a little bit. And it can be a good feeling, it can be serene or something. I think what's happening, my daughter being a young person, 25, lives in New York, and there's a whole kind of wave of young people taking meditation now, going to yoga, looking for a way to enter that solitude, you know, with more relaxation. The best time for us is when we're totally relaxed and the capacities that are within us function much better. And we can only do that if we have an interiority of consciousness. And art, to me, if it has the provoking aspect, see, it's got to have tension too. when you talk about what you were talking about. I mean, it's not just lying on the couch. You know, it's got to have some kind of tension. And to me, philosophically, it's got to go beyond the opposites. It's got to go beyond the opposites in order to really come into the stilling solitude of what we can experience. The opposites are always swaying. You know, the pendulum is always swinging. We identify with happiness, we identify with sadness, we identify with light, we identify with dark. But it's beyond that. You know, that merges. There's a place that converges. You know, incongruities converge in a certain place within us. And it's, as we were talking about the other day, is that the baton has been passed on by people of great wisdom that have really been seekers, that maybe took their whole life or something to come to that point, but really passed that baton on that there's something deeper and respectful and natural within us that can only be touched by the sense of contemplation, introspection, and meditation, or whatever you want to call it. But we feel it all the time. I mean, it's a spontaneous thing too. You know, spontaneity is one of the most sacred actions, and we don't take it as a sacred action. You know, many people say, oh, wow, this thing happened, you know. How did it happen? Someone was working for me, or whatever. This spontaneous moment of intuition or understanding or the capacity to do something you couldn't do. It's all within us. And the other thing I should say is that, you know, as we're talking, I mean, it's not, you know, these are not definitives of mine. You know, Orpheus came afterwards. I mean, I created these things, and they were speaking, as, you know, I didn't think of Orpheus before. He was speaking to me, in a sense. And they're kind of open-ended, you know, which I believe art should be open-ended, but at the same time, there's a focus to bring that language, like we had been speaking about before, to its last vestige, in a sense. And that is the takeoff point. That is the takeoff point of really contemplation, you know, in one's own sense of why you're looking at a piece of art. And so I got skirted away. I'm not sure if I carried the question to...
Well, let me pick up on something else. You mentioned spontaneity, and I want to think about that as well as dynamism, which is another dimension of your art that we talked about together. And the pieces here, when I first looked at them, one of the first associations that came to my mind is they're all standing, you know, at attention with their arms bound almost to their sides. And it reminded me actually of an image from the very early in Black Elk Speaks, where as a 9-year-old he's ill, and for the first time when he's contacted by the other world, the great, the 6 grandfathers, he doesn't know yet that they are the ones who are contacting him, but they're 2 messengers who appear in the sky, and they are flying like arrows, head first, presumably with their arms at their side. He doesn't mention that, but there's no other way that you could imagine them, like arrows. Yes. And so when I first saw these, even though they're standing still, and they're, even if they were real persons, that would be their posture, but there's this sense of movement as well. And some of the binding of the figures, you can almost sense the wrapping of the whatever it is that binds them in their position. You only notice maybe a hand here, the toes there, but otherwise their bodies are entirely enwrapped. And I wondered if you, in a cocoon-like manner, we talked about that, and I wondered if you could comment on that part of it.
Yes, of course. Well, in a sense, I think the relationship to, say, the treeness, the angel tree shapeshifter in a sense, and in relationship to sort of the other figures, is that there is traveling. There is traveling. And of course, I'm trying to induce inner traveling, but also space-age traveling, in a sense. I mean, these could be sort of space-age suits, or they could be the bark of a tree or something, and another type of circulation. You're right. I mean, the arrow, which I often use, sort of in my paintings to a certain extent, but just as symbols and so forth, has not only a literal sense to it, but it also has a symbolic sign of traveling, but also hitting a target, hitting something. So once again, when I go back to the idea of the concentric and hitting the circle, hitting the center, hitting that moment of union, hitting that moment of background of harmony, hitting that moment of entirety, it's all within us. But if these can be vehicles to sort of bring out these thought patterns to kind of go further, then I feel that it's doing something. And so what I can say is that many people will interpret it in different ways, but it does have a sense of traveling. You know what I mean? It has that. And the power of this kind of contradicts the power of this. So once again, we have these opposites, and it's in between, I don't know, like in between the opposites, or beyond the opposites, or in between the paradoxes, that we often feel the harmony background of these actions. And to me, that's most important. And I think, if I can just talk a little bit, I think artists in general are very attracted to the harmonic aspect, the background of this organization. Some people will just talk about it aesthetically, that it all has to fit together. Other people will actually talk about it philosophically. I talk about it both. I feel the alchemy of the work is sort of the material that is being fused, always with a sense of going into the background of the harmony. So that, in a sense, you could talk about, I don't have a literal sense of the body. So you pick up little flickerings like the toes down there, right? Or the hands, or this or that, or concave, whatever. It really carries you around, but you don't get stuck. You keep going around, you're wondering. And that unto itself gives me a feeling that it's fused together, And that's important. I mean, it's just like in the little painting, there's a lot of really activity going on. But if you really go up, you'll discover, like this head and so forth, that there's a musical background to it. And I'm really, as a metaphor, music plays a big part. And what I mean by that is not the auditory music, but the inner music, which has the rhythm, and within language, visual language, within spoken language. I mean, poetry has, of course, music. And so I try to give these actions, these metaphors, these forms, a sense of a background that has a resonance to it. And anyway, so somewhere in